Every offseason, we ask the same question about Jorge Mateo. Will there be space for him on this Orioles roster next year? And you know what? This offseason is a lot of the same. So we will try to answer that question about Mateo and recap his 2024 season. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we continue our Orioles 2024 player season review series, where we take a look at almost every player on the 40-man roster and give them an episode to break down their 2024 season, what went right, what went wrong, and the biggest storyline for the player heading into the offseason. And today, we move things on to talking about Jorge Mateo. Now, it was an interesting season for Mateo. He had some good, he had some bad, he also had some injuries. And it's that same question I mentioned. Is there space for him in 2025? Well, we're certainly going to try to find it. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So let's talk Jorge Mateo, a guy that you may have forgotten about a little bit because the Orioles didn't have him for the final 2 months of the season. Now, you may remember in 2023, Jorge Mateo wasn't very good. His 67 WRC plus in 350 plate appearances. He was basically the worst qualified hitter from May 1st on last year, after he was one of the best hitters in baseball in April of 2023. And then he had a 4-hit game, I believe, 3-hit game, 4-hit game in the postseason in the ALDS against the Rangers. He was one of the few players who showed out in that ALDS. Now, we didn't have a chance to back it up again in the AL Wildcard Series this year because Mateo was out with injury at the end of the season. We'll get to that in a moment, but let's start with what went right for Jorge Mateo in 2024. And the big one was he continued to hit lefties, but at an even much greater rate. Now, Mateo in his career has always been much better against left-handed pitchers as a right-handed hitter. 94 career WRC plus against lefties versus a 70 career WRC plus against righties. Now, you'll notice both of those below league average, but he's had years where he's been above average against lefties and sometimes been almost unplayable against righties. And that stratification got even bigger in 2024. Mateo had a 127 WRC plus against left-handed pitching in 90 plate appearances against lefties this year. That's pretty dominant. He had 118 plate appearances against righties. The Orioles did the best to keep him away from righties as much as they could. He had a 57 WRC plus against righties. He was 43% worse than league average against right-handed pitching. That is a huge platoon splits guy. And Mateo's always been that, but this was the biggest gap between lefties and righties that we have seen from Jorge Mateo. And some of that is because he didn't play as much. He was injured. He got 208 plate appearances. The only time he's had less was in 2020 with the Padres when he had 28 plate appearances in 22 games. Every other big league season, he's had more than 208 plate appearances. So a little bit could be some smaller sample size theater, but still, it was kind of interesting how he did it. Now, what's most interesting to me is that Mateo's always been a guy who you got to find your way on base. We know the speed. We know he can play defense. We know he can change a game on the base pass. He can hit a little bit, but he would strike out so much he couldn't find his way on base. What was funny is that he struck out more against lefties than he did against righties this year. 24% K rate against lefties, 22% K rate against righties. The way you think about Jorge Mateo in your head is like he has these strikeout issues, and it's because he'll swing at a breaking ball from a righty that ends up 1.5 feet outside, and he just can't lay off anything breaking out of the zone from a right-hander. That is how you think about Jorge Mateo as a hitter. And some of it's still kind of true. He swung and missed 28% of the time and hit .089 against breaking balls from right-handed pitchers this year. So yeah, he really, if you were a righty and you threw him a curveball or a slider, he just was not going to hit it. However, those whiff numbers were down from what they usually are. And although the batting average was still terrible, he didn't swing and miss as much. He put the ball in play a little bit more. And he just kind of put the ball in play more in general this year. 23.1% strikeout rate was the lowest of his career. It came with a 4.8% walk rate, which was his lowest since 2021, but a low strikeout rate. He had the lowest swing and miss rate of his career. And the thing I mentioned about the breaking balls from righties, he was still bad against them. But if a lefty threw him a curveball or a slider or a sweeper, it was go time. Jorge Mateo hit .364 with a .636 slugging percentage against breaking balls by left-handed pitchers this year. If you hung a curveball to Jorge Mateo as a lefty, watch out. He did damage to those pitches. And really, the stuff that he did, cutting down on the strikeouts, smashing lefties, it led to, if you cut out the minimums, the best offensive season of his career. Now, I mentioned that it was 208 plate appearances. Last year, he had 350. 2022, 533. 2021, 209. This is the least he's played, again, since his shortened rookie season in the COVID year with the Padres in 2020. And that is because of the injuries that we will get to. But his 87 WRC plus this year in those 208 plate appearances, again, is below league average, but was the best of his career by a little bit. He had an 84 in 2022. He had an 83 in 2021. So it's mostly on par, but he did some things differently. As I mentioned, career low whiff rates and strikeout rates. Okay, he had a career high slugging percentage of 401, career high isolated power at 172. In the much smaller amount of plate appearances, he still hit 5 home runs. He hit 7 home runs in 140 more plate appearances last year. So he showed some power a little bit this season. And he started strong again. He had a good April. He had a good May. Now, it wasn't the lighting the world on fire he did in April of 2023, but he had a good first 2 months, which was really helpful for him because once the Orioles, Jackson Holliday didn't make the opening day roster, but was up in mid-April and then started really, really struggling in April and May. When the Orioles then sent Holliday back down to AAA, it allowed Mateo to kind of really fill in a lot of those at-bats at second base for a while because he had set up that, hey, I've had a really good first 2 months. So when Holliday went down, Mateo filled in even against some righties as well, even though he did certainly struggle in those spots. And it seemed to be kind of a concerted effort by Jorge Mateo. He wanted to make more contact this year and use his speed. And it worked to an extent. And you like him making adjustments like that. We know he doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world. We know he's limited as an offensive player, but he made adjustments to try and help with that. And you love to see that. And here's the other thing. He's always going to have issues with breaking balls from righties. It's just the player he is. He's not going to break out of that. But he has to then do damage against other stuff. So I mentioned the breaking balls against lefties. He crushed them. He also, although he's still swinging and missing at right-handed off-speed stuff, he's not swinging and missing against fastballs anymore. He hit pretty well against fastballs, but he had just a 15% swing and miss rate against fastballs this year. That is way lower than it's ever been in the big leagues for him. And that is good too, because, hey, if you can put fastballs in play, you're going to get on base a little bit more. If guys know they can beat you with fastballs and breaking balls, the day is over. And that's what we saw from Mateo in a lot of his career previously. And the last thing was he did continue to use his tools well. Now, he's never going to have the defensive season he had at shortstop in 2022 when he frankly should have won the AL Gold Glove that year and didn't even become a finalist. He won the Fielding Bible Award, which usually does a better job of giving it out to the best defenders in the league. But he still was league average, solid. He passed the eye test, mostly was playing second base, but still played a little shortstop and a little bit of center field this year defensively, which we'll get to, but still passed the eye test. And of course, the speed is still there. Now, because he's still not a great hitter and because of the playing time, he was never an everyday player this year, and then he got injured. He only stole 13 bases. Now, he was 13 for 15, so when he tried, he was mostly successful. It wasn't the last 2 years when he stole 35 and 32 bases. That was because he was playing a lot more and was just on first base a whole lot more because of that. But was still 13 for 15, was still used as a pinch runner at times and could change a game. But he still used those tools that have given him success in the past as well. And, I hope you listened to the James McCann season recap episode from yesterday. If not, go back and check that one out. But the Mateo conversation is kind of similar, right? At the end of the day, you look at his offense. Okay, he's still a below league average hitter, but he did a lot of things better than usual this year in some limited playing time. But in the big picture, there are still things that didn't go right and don't go right for Jorge Mateo. And that's what we're going to talk about coming up next. He still wasn't a super productive hitter, and he also just wasn't able to stay on the field this year. We will break that down coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app, well, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Now, unfortunately, you won't be buying any more Orioles tickets on Game Time for a few months, but they got World Series tickets over at Game Time. So if you want to make a trip up to New York to see some World Series games next weekend, maybe check out Game Times for the best deals out there. Game Time picks, their curation makes it easier to save on sports. They got flash deals, that exclusive in-app deals to save on seats. But it's not just sports, right? It is almost the baseball offseason. It's the offseason for the Orioles. Concerts, comedy, theater, Game Time has it all. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and more with Game Time picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So for Jorge Mateo, there was certainly some good this year, but there was also certainly some bad. Let's talk about what went wrong for Mateo as we recap his 2024 season. And really the big one was he got injured twice and just couldn't stay on the field. And it's not to say he would have had a long stretch at all this year where he truly was the Orioles' everyday second baseman, but he got some chances in May when Holiday went down. He was playing most days. And with the injuries the Orioles had around him in the infield late in the year, he probably would have gotten a good amount of chances in August and September as well. Now, he had kind of a freak injury in June. He was placed on the 7-day concussion IL on June 3rd after he reached out to get a bat weight. He was in the hole. Cedric Mullins was on deck in the on-deck circle. You may remember this, you may not. Mateo, as Mullins was kind of swinging the bat around to warm up his shoulder, Mateo reached out to the on-deck circle from like the top step of the dugout to grab a bat weight, and just inadvertently, Mullins on the swing swung his bat back and hit Mateo in the head with his bat. Now, luckily, Mateo was already wearing his helmet at the time, and that is something to really be thankful for, but still had to hurt, and it did give him concussion, and he did go on the IL and miss a little over a week. Now, on the flip side, he returned from the IL on June 11th to face Braves lefty and hopefully future Oriole Max Fried, and he hit a 3-run homer off Fried in his first AB coming off the concussion IL. So that one hopefully didn't impact him too much, although the concussions are not something you want to take lightly at all. We saw what they did to Heston Kjerstad for a good stretch this year. But the injury he got next was, in terms of missing time, much more serious. Went on the IL again on July 25th with a left elbow subluxation after a nasty collision in the field with Gunnar Henderson in Miami, where they kind of collided on a ground ball. Nobody got the out. Mateo's arm got like twisted and bent behind him. Luckily, it was his left arm, his non-throwing arm, but it was still a nasty injury. He came out of the game. He went on the IL, and it was kind of unsure for a little bit what exactly the injury would be, how long he'd be out, would it need surgery. But we eventually got the news later, I believe in August, that he had to have UCL reconstruction surgery on his left elbow and get the internal brace, a surgery similar to not exactly Tommy John, but kind of the step down from that pitchers get from time to time. Mateo had to get that on his left elbow and his left UCL because that's how messed up it got on that play. Now, I don't think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, jump in the YouTube comments, if the Orioles have definitely said like, hey, he'll be ready for opening day 2025, I think the Orioles are still have questions about that, and he may have to miss some time also early next season. Like, I don't think he's definitely not going to be a full go at, day one of spring training, I would think. We'll see after that. The Orioles are hoping to get him back at least early in the 2025 season. I do know that. But it was really just another thing that contributed to the Orioles' offensive struggles. Now, again, Jorge Mateo, 87 WRC+, not an everyday player. He's not the biggest piece they lost. They lost 5 hitters for a stretch there. You could argue that he's number 5. You could argue that Jordan Westberg, Ryan Mountcastle, Ramon Arias, Heston Kjerstad, all more important to this Orioles lineup than Jorge Mateo is. You could put him number 5 of 5. But Again, as I mentioned, 27% better than league average as a hitter against left-handed pitching. And you add up Mateo to the fact that Mountcastle, Urias, Westberg, also all right-handers who all hit lefties well. Mateo added to the mix of the Orioles lineup just being much worse in the second half versus lefties. Before the Mateo injury, the Orioles were the fourth best offense in baseball against left-handed pitching, and it didn't go all the way down, but it went down to more like the 10th range when they missed all those guys, including Jorge Mateo. And you could put him in there against lefties and feel good that he was going to produce at the bottom of the lineup against the left-handed pitcher, and then you just pull him for a pinch hitter when a righty comes in out of the bullpen. That was still very helpful for this Orioles team, and to not have him out there was tough, and that was just a weird, kind of ugly injury to watch him have as well. And then the other thing really that went wrong is just he's still not a reliable hitter, right? We can say all these things and what he did against lefties, but at the end of the day, at 87 WRC plus is 13% below league average. It's not good, and especially not good when that is your career high in one season. You're looking at a career 79 WRC plus in like 1,300 big league plate appearances for Jorge Mateo. Like he's a 224 career hitter. It's not something you want to completely hang your hat on, right? This year, the total stats I mentioned: 68 games, 208 plate appearances, hit 229. 267 on base, 401 slug for the 87 WRC plus, 4.8% walk rate, 23.1% strikeout rate, 5 homers, 18 ribbies on the year for Jorge Mateo. Had 14 doubles and a couple of triples as well. But just, it's not just the lack of production. He doesn't necessarily have a lot of good like underlying StatCast data that backs it up. He's not a guy where it's like, wow, he hits the ball so hard, or he doesn't chase, or he barrels it up, or he makes good swing decisions, or whatever it may be. He doesn't have a lot of that stuff. So it can feel like at times, especially when he is mashing lefties like he did when he was on the field this year, that he's almost like Mateo just maximizing what he can do, and the speed and the defense just kind of keeps him in the big leagues as a utility player beyond that. And maybe there is another step for him offensively, but I just don't see it. I mean, he's good against lefties, good defender, great speed, good against lefties. Right? Like he is still one of the fastest players in baseball, still 8th in the major leagues in sprint speed, according to StatCast this year. That is still a huge tool for him that can help him keep a big league job. But again, I feel like there's not a much higher ceiling to get to. I mean, maybe you hope he can get to a fully league average hitter. If he can do that, he becomes even more valuable. But even with the success against lefties, you see way more righties than you do lefties. He still doesn't hit for a lot of power when he does that. He still doesn't hit the ball necessarily hard. And guess what? As I mentioned, he's basically unplayable against right-handed pitching. It is tough to roster a guy who's basically unplayable against most of the pitching that you will see. And that is the final question for Jorge Mateo heading into the offseason, heading into 2025. Is he playable? Is he rosterable? Is there a spot for Jorge Mateo with the Orioles next year? Try to answer that coming up next to finish off the pod. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You really cannot beat that deal. You get all the college football, all the pro football, all the World Series, basketball, hockey, whatever it is, get it all. And that's at FanDuel.com. So for Jorge Mateo, the question is now, what comes next? Now, he is still under contract. He is not becoming a free agent. He still has one more year before he would hit free agency. He becomes a free agent after the 2025 season. So this could be his final season as an Oriole, but there's also the possibility that we already saw his final season as an Oriole, because he's going to be in at least a little bit of roster limbo this offseason. He's entering his final year of arbitration. He just had this elbow surgery. He might not be ready for opening day. The Orioles infield is getting more and more crowded by the minute. And although he brings some things skill-wise that you really want in a utility infielder, The bat is not there. He's getting more expensive. He's not getting expensive. MLB Trade Rumors projects him to make $3.2 million in his final year of arbitration in 2025. I mean, if he makes your team as a utility infielder, like that's absolutely worth $3.2 million. If you're picking up a utility infielder in free agency, it's probably going to cost you more than $3.2 million for 1 year. So money-wise, especially with David Rubenstein now in charge, should not be any kind of issue here for the Orioles and Jorge Mateo. He should not be any kind of non-tender candidate this offseason. It would be more like just maybe doesn't make the team and gets DFA'd at the end of spring training if he doesn't make it. But it's tough to see like a locked-in spot for him. Now, if he's not ready for opening day, there's a roundabout way that could actually help him and his future with the Orioles, because there's always so many tough decisions to make around opening day. Of course, Mateo is out of options. So, if he doesn't make the team, he gets DFA'd and he probably gets claimed. You probably lose him to another ball club. But if he's not ready, like say he's not going to be ready till May, it gives you a little more time, right, to figure things out with other guys in April. Somebody's bound to get hurt. Maybe when Mateo comes back, it works better where he just fills in for someone right there and takes that roster spot. The decisions are always tougher on opening day. But the question you have to boil it down to is, does he have a roster spot? Say he's healthy and good by opening day. Is there a spot for Jorge Mateo? Now, there's going to be 13 hitters on this team on opening day. Gunnar Henderson, Jordan Westburg, Jackson Holliday, Ramon Arias, Ryan Mountcastle, Ryan O'Hearn, Adley Rutschman, whoever the backup catcher is, Cedric Mullins, Colton Cowser, Anthony Santander, or whoever the free agent replacement is as a right-handed hitting outfielder for Anthony Santander, and Heston Kjerstad. That is 12 players right now there. Now, you could argue Kjerstad's not a lot. You could argue Mountcastle or O'Hearn could be gone this offseason. You could argue Arias is not a lock. I mean, you could maybe argue Holliday is not a lock. So it's not like every single one of those guys, hey, they have 12 spots filled up. But it would seem at least likely that those 12 guys have a roster spot. That leaves one spot for Jorge Mateo, but then to also battle it out with Kobe Mayo. Can he hold off Kobe Mayo because he's versatile? Can he just show he's a better option than Livan Soto or Emmanuel Rivera if those guys are around? Are the Orioles going to look to, even if they do bring back Santander, still bring in another right-handed hitting, fourth or fifth outfielder type as a free agent, like bring back an Austin Slater type or another player like him that would take a spot from Jorge Mateo? In terms of what you want Mateo to do as a utility guy, right? He can play second, he can play short, he could play third if you needed him to. Again, 8th fastest runner in baseball by sprint speed via StatCast. He's an amazing pinch runner weapon. And again, was really, really good hitting left-handed pitching. So you can still at least start him against lefties or pinch hit him late in games against lefties and feel good about him in those scenarios at the plate. That all lines up to be a guy who you can still roster in the big leagues as a utility guy who's not going to start that much, but is still going to help your team. The only thing is, are your other options better? I feel like we always compare him with Ramon Arias. With what Arias did down the stretch, filling in for those injuries, Arias is, I think, well above Mateo right now. Arias feels like a lot more of a lock to be on the roster next year than Jorge Mateo does. But Mateo still brings some things that Arias can't do, like that speed. It's a lot of questions you got to answer with Jorge Mateo. Here's what I think it comes down to. Like, Arias hit well enough where if maybe they wanted to do like a platoon with Holliday at second base for a while, Arias was hitting lefties better. It could be Arias and Holliday. It wouldn't be Mateo. Here's what it might come down to. Jorge Mateo started a couple of games, played a total of 17 innings in center field defensively for the Orioles last year. Earlier in his career, he had played a little bit of outfield in the big leagues as well. They were trying to play him in center to platoon him with Mullins when Mullins was really, really struggling, couldn't hit lefties at all in the first half of the season. The Orioles will want, I think, whether or not they bring back Santander. If Santander walks, they'll look for a bigger name. If they bring back Santander, I still think they're going to want a fourth or fifth outfielder type who hits right-handed. So the question will be, for Jorge Mateo, can he play the outfield at all? Can he show that he has the ability to play center and maybe even a little bit of left field or right field, because that would be helpful too. If he can show you that he is passable in preferably all three outfield positions, maybe not to the point where you're starting him a lot out there, but where you could put him in there if you had to. You could start him a couple of games if you had to. If he can show that I've still got the speed, I can still play the infield defense, and I can play the outfield and hit lefties, that allows him to have a spot. If they're not feeling great about the outfield defense, I think they could take a Kobe Mayo or take a fifth outfielder type right-handed hitter over Jorge Mateo. I think there's still a good chance he's on this team. Don't get me wrong. I think his chances are better than 50% if he's healthy of making the opening day roster, if you're asking me, right now on October 22nd. But things could change this offseason. And I really think something he's going to want to work on is, we know what he is as a hitter, right? If he can hit lefties, can't hit righties, whatever. Like, there might be still another step up for him offensively, but we kind of know what he is. We understand it. We're not trying to play him every day. If he can add the outfield truly, not just 17 innings this year, but truly to the mix, that makes him so much more valuable as a utility bench player, because he's not just an infielder. He's now a full utility guy you can move around and still gives you value against lefties as a hitter and can pinch run late in games. And remember, then if you pinch run him for basically anyone, unless it's a first baseman or a catcher, he could then fill in that spot defensively, so you're not taking up the entire bench if he is used more of a pinch hitter. That's where the outfield comes into play. I think that's going to be a huge, huge part of his offseason. Like, the speed is great. The hitting lefties is important. But I think being able to play the outfield is going to make or break his 2025 roster status, because the O's will still have decisions on him. Because again, 2025 is still either way going to be his last year under contract. $3.2 million shouldn't swing things here, but it's going to be interesting to see how healthy he is with this elbow injury and then where he falls in when we get to Sarasota next year. If you had to make me guess right now, I'd say he does make the opening day roster. But again, keep an eye on a little bit of talk this offseason about him playing the outfield. That could be the make or break for Jorge Mateo in 2025. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. We're getting close to 8,000 subscribers. When we get there, we're going to do a fun giveaway here on the show, but you have to be subscribed to be entered for the giveaway. Also, leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it is. Those ratings and reviews really, really help out the show. I'll be back tomorrow. We're still going through 5 days a week here on the Locked On Podcast Network, even with the Orioles out. Might do a little World Series preview on the podcast tomorrow from an Orioles perspective, rooting interest, former O's players, guys who could be free agents that the O's could pick up. The Orioles fan guide to the 2024 World Series looks like that'll be coming to you on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.